Today I'm going to discuss in this video the Constitution, how it came about, why it replaced the Articles of Confederation, the opposers of the Constitution, and we'll discuss too what the Constitution says and briefly outline the Bill of Rights. We've heard of the Constitution with a capital C, but what is a Constitution in general? So the definition of Constitution is a document embodying law that limits the power of the government. What this means is that the government does not have the free will to do whatever it wants, as we see in some totalitarian regimes and some monarchies of the past where the king or the ruler had ultimate authority to do what they wanted, and they were literally above the law. With a constitution, the government is not above the law, and it is up to the people to grant that individual or this governing body permission to rule. The Constitution of the United States was written in 1787. And it's still in usage today. And in fact, it's the oldest constitution used in the world. It was created technically illegally under opposition, and it's full of compromise. It was very important to compromise in order to keep the states together as a union, because as I stated, there was opposition to the Constitution when it was being written. It was ultimately born out of the failure of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were not a failure for all. Some were happy to keep this original form of the U.S. government intact, but others and the majority of those who sought out this sort of constitution realized that the Articles of Confederation simply were not working and would not provide for a successful government for the future of the United States. So to remind you all, the Articles of Confederation, this was the first U.S. Constitution. It's not a constitution with a capital C, but it was the first constitution that was ratified or given formal consent. So ratification, this is the act of giving formal consent. So the Articles of Confederation was fully ratified in 1781 by the end of the Revolutionary War. This was the first U.S. government, and it was a loose union of independent states. There was a national government, but it was very weak and did not have the power to do much. Instead, each state was looked at as a small republic, self-governing itself. The national government, it had the power primarily to secure national defense, but it did not have the power to tax in order to fund the national defense. So the two main reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed, and they're related, is one, the national government did not have the ability to impose tax, and number two, because they couldn't impose taxes, the government could not provide for the common defense. As a result of this, this was spurred after Shays' Rebellion. This was a rebellion that caused the government to realize that they needed a stronger centralized power in order to maintain peace and order in these newly formed states, because potentially another revolution could break out, and what was keeping these states bound together the Articles of Confederation was, but it wasn't strong enough according to quite a few people who sought out a new constitution. So in 1787, delegates met secretly to create this new government, granting more federal powers and the ability to tax and ultimately provide for the common defense. While many supported the institution of this new constitution, there was intense opposition as well. So some delegates simply refused to sign. There were elected delegates that went to the Constitutional Convention. This was in Philadelphia in 1787. And these delegates, we would call them the framers, these are the ones that came up with the content that would be in the Constitution and ultimately wrote it and came up with various compromises. These were called the Framers, and they consisted of 29 college graduates, 27 notables such as George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, among others. And of this group, 34 were lawyers, and the rest were farmers and merchants. So many were from the upper echelons of society. Patrick Henry of Virginia, he refused to attend this convention because, as he stated, he smelt a rat. So some thought this was a pretty shady thing that was going on, this new government that was being formed in secret. So those that supported the new Constitution, or let's say a stronger federal government, they were called Federalists. And those that didn't were called Anti-Federalists. And these Anti-Federalists, they had a variety of reasons for their opposition to the Constitution. One was that the Constitution was being drafted in an illegal manner. It violated the procedure laid out in the Articles of Confederation. Another reason was it was believed that a constitution or a stronger federal government would weaken state governments and challenge local authority. Others feared that individual liberty could only be preserved in small republics, meaning these states, some argued, offered the best chance of self-government. And lastly, others had the impression that the Constitution was designed to promote a commercial empire, which was at odds with the agrarian values of many Americans. In light of this opposition to the Constitution was ultimately passed and ratified. And this was due to a variety of compromises. So there were compromises made between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, between states with large populations and states with small populations. There was a variety of compromises for a variety of reasons, and people envisioned the federal government in different ways. So what we see today is a government that attempts to take into account these different views that the early framers had in how a federal government ought to look. So one of the more prominent compromises was the Great Compromise. This combined two proposals for how the legislative branch should look. This was the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. So the Virginia Plan envisioned a bicameral legislature, and that the number of representatives in the legislature would be based on state population. Whereas the New Jersey Plan, they envisioned a unicameral legislature where each state had an equal number of representatives in this unicameral body of legislature. Ultimately, their plans were combined, and we have the legislative body that we see today, which is bicameral, and the number of House representatives is based on state population, whereas the number of senators is equal throughout each state. There are 435 representatives and 100 senators. Another compromise, one that is more of a blight on American history, would be the 3/5 Compromise. And in this compromise, it was stated that when calculating the population of each state, the slave population would be considered in that total. However, each slave would only be counted as 3/5 of a person. This was the sort of compromise that was between slave holding states, or states, well, every state really was, but states that had a larger slave population than others. There were quite a few abolitionists at this point in time as well, those that sought to completely end slavery. And enacted a compromise that would ultimately end the slave trade by 1808. They stated that the slave trade needed to end, but they didn't think that they'd get away with ending it immediately. So the compromise was that no more new slaves from Africa would come in by 1808. So there was at least some movement at this point towards ending the slave trade and ending slavery. So what does the Constitution say? At this point, I encourage you to read the Constitution. It's not very long. It's about 6,000 words. And it's in the back of the textbook or in other various places online, definitely. So just whatever you prefer, you should definitely read the Constitution. There are 7 articles in the Constitution outlining the structure and function of the U.S. government. And what it does, it outlines the procedure rather than the substance or outcomes. So the Constitution doesn't particularly advocate that there needs to be a certain outcome, just more so the procedure of what to do in various situations within the government. It's purposely vague and it's purposely brief. And it's vague because it's meant to be adaptable. There's a clause, it's called the elastic clause of the elasticity clause. And this states that the Constitution is intended to endure for ages to come and consequently to be adapted to various crises of human affairs. So it's supposed to be up for interpretation, some aspects of it anyways. So there are expressed powers and there are implied powers. So there are some powers that are explicitly stated that the government has in the Constitution, and there are other powers that through reading the various articles, one can get the implication that certain powers are allowed. It's up for interpretation. And one of the primary interpreters, or the main interpreter of the Constitution, is the Supreme Court. And they interpret the Constitution under a concept or authority known as judicial review. So what the Supreme Court does is they interpret the Constitution, and later they create precedent for how the Constitution is later interpreted. So if there's a purposely vague piece of the Constitution that the Supreme Court at some point in time, a case is brought before them and they're meant to interpret the Constitution, whatever ruling they have on that case later sets the basis for other cases that have a similar issue that was raised in that particular case. So people don't necessarily go back to the Constitution, they go back to similar rulings and cases and precedents set by Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court. So here's the articles of the Constitution in a nutshell. This is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but let's just have a look. So you have the preamble, we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union. This is a preamble that most of us have heard. It's quite famous. The first article, it gives powers to Congress. The second gives powers to the president or the executive. The third gives powers to the judicial branch. The fourth article is about relations between states. The fifth is related to amending the Constitution. It outlines the procedure for that. The sixth states that the Constitution is supreme. It's the supreme law of the land. And the seventh article details how the Constitution should be ratified or how it should be legally brought into effect. And at that point in time, 9 states had to approve the Constitution in order to make it come into effect. So let's pause a moment here and read this quote. So what does this quote mean to you? In framing a government, the greatest difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So this quote is by James Madison. He was an early Federalist. He later became an anti-Federalist, but this was written when he was advocating for the Constitution in the Federalist Papers. And what we can see here is that this quote essentially states that the government's obligation is to control the governed, which sounds very anti-liberty and anti-self-government. But it states here too that the next place the government does need to control itself as well. So the government keeps peace and order in society, but the government is not above the law. It is bound by the Constitution. So if you were the newly formed American government under the Constitution and you had all these new powers granted to you or implied to you, what would be the first thing that you would do? Well, one of the first things that the government did under the newly formed Constitution was issue a tax. They now had the ability to tax, and they acted upon that power. So one of the first taxes, commonly known as the whiskey tax, it was enacted in 1791. And this was a tax on distilled liquor manufacturers, and it was used to raise revenue to pay off the national debt that was quite large as a result of the Revolutionary War. Those who were making whiskey or distilled liquors, they were mostly farmers, and they would make whiskey out of their surplus grain. This tax caused these farmers to rebel, and they rebelled for 4 years until ultimately 13,000 militiamen were called to stop the rebellion, and they were called upon by the federal government. So the government, under the Constitution, they used their ability to tax and provide for the common defense, all in this one sort of rebellion, and it really showed how strong the U.S. government was at that point in time under the powers granted to them by the Constitution. Let's have a look at this question here. Should Washington, D.C. have representation in Congress? Currently, Washington, D.C., they do not have representation in Congress. They do have electoral votes in the presidential election, and they do have representatives that can sit in on congressional committees, but they do not have actual representatives in Congress. If you have a look at this little political cartoon here, it states they called it tyranny in 1776, this idea of no taxation without representation. So those in Washington, D.C., they do have to pay taxes, however, they don't have a representation in Congress. So this is something that's up for debate. The Supreme Court ruled that Washington, D.C. should not have representation in Congress. But what do you think? That's something to sort of consider here when we look at the history of American tax rebellion, let's say, and this issue of representation in government. Let's have a look here too at the peculiar institution in the South. This was what many early Americans referred to the institution of slavery as a peculiar institution. And this was because many Americans, especially those in government, realized that the ideals set forth in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence did not gel with the existence of slavery. Slavery did not exist only in the South. It existed in a variety of different states, but the states ultimately banned slavery over time. So it was called a peculiar institution because, as I stated, the government was well aware that this was extremely hypocritical to have slaves in the wake of this dawn of liberty and freedom and these sort of this idealist political values that existed in both, as I stated, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So that's something to think about. What do you think of this way of describing the institution of slavery? I'll speak here briefly about the amendments to the Constitution. So the Constitution itself cannot be changed. However, it can be added on to. However, it's very difficult to have any additions actually make it to the point of being added to the Constitution. Just to give further emphasis to that point, about 5,000 amendments have been proposed to be added to the Constitution, and they have ultimately died, and only 27 have been passed, 10 of which would be considered part of the Bill of Rights, so only 17 since 1791 have been passed. The allowance of amendments is the fact that it keeps the Constitution intact, but it allows, again, for this elasticity. The process of enacting an amendment, so the first step is that either 2/3 of Congress in both houses have to agree that this amendment should be proposed, or 2/3 of state legislatures. Then the next step, in order for the amendment to be ratified, is that 3/4 of the legislatures by the states have to agree to ratify the amendment, or 3/4 held by conventions held in states. So 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment. And as I say, this has only happened 27 times out of 5,000 or more. So again, the way that the amendments do pass, this shows here how the proposal process has worked in reality, not just in theory. Every time the proposal was by 2/3 of the vote of both houses of Congress, and 26 times it was ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures, and only one time was the ratification due to the passage by 3/4 of special state conventions, and that was Amendment 21, the one to repeal prohibition. For the first 10 amendments, those are called the Bill of Rights, and these are our basic rights that these were added to the Constitution not long after it was fully ratified. And it was very important for the Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution in order to gain support by these anti-federalists. They feared that the federal government would infringe upon certain rights of individuals. And I'll give a brief summary here of the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment, this is the right to free speech, to free expression. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The third is that there's no quartering of troops without permission in your house. Fourth is related to searches, seizures, and warrants. The fifth is about the criminal procedure and fair trial for the rights of those accused. The sixth is the same, except this is the rights of those who are on trial. The seventh is related to jury trials and in civil suits. The eighth states no cruel and unusual punishment. And the ninth, this is the recognition of rights not enumerated. That means that some rights are inherent, but they're not expressed in the Constitution. So people ought to have their rights protected, even if the Constitution doesn't state exactly what those rights are. And the last one is that the powers of the states ought to be protected as well. So it protects the states against the federal government. And you can have a look here. This picture puts it into simple terms as well. But I encourage you to read the Bill of Rights also in its entirety and to become familiar with the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So to summarize, the Constitution outlines the structure and function of the United States government, and it both grants and limits power to the government. And it was born out of the failure of the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitution is actually America's second form of government and it ultimately strengthened the powers of the federal government and granted Congress the right to tax.